Good morning, everybody. I'm Carrie Barrett, president of the New York Botanical Gardens. I always love how when things get dark, people also get quiet. It's dark and quiet because we're all so excited to hear Margaret Roach. It is our pleasure to have you speaking here today. As spring is burgeoning in the garden, daffodils aren't quite out yet, but if you have a chance to wander around today, you will see little things cropping up. I'm going to tell you that I live in Harlem, but I ran in Central Park today, and it's so interesting how, because the daffodils are fully up, daffodils and crocuses and lots of colorful things, only, 5 miles south, but it's just a little bit colder up here, so keep an eye out. The orchid show is spectacular. Just a plug for the orchid show. If some of you have time after the lecture today, I couldn't recommend it highly enough. And it feels like a vacation. It smells good, it's humid, everything is always so drippy because our wonderful gardeners in the Enid Haupt Conservatory spray the orchids every morning. It's just the most marvelous things. You can tell I'm so happy to work here. I've been here 8 months, and I am so happy to be in a job that gets me outdoors every day. We're here to celebrate the release of her revamped classic, A Way to Garden. Perhaps we'd say, as Dr. Spock was to raising children, Margaret Roach is to raising gardens. If some of you, I could even ask, how many of you have an early edition of this book that is thumbed, or there you go, it probably looks like, or I think of The Joy of Cooking. I have these books that are, right, Dr. Spock, The Joy of Cooking, books that are so loved, so well worn, in this case probably with smudges of dirt and soil and, seeds that found their way in there. Back when it was first published in 1998, it was named the best book by Garden Writers of America. This month marks the 10th anniversary of Margaret's award-winning public radio show, A Way to Garden, which I love. I listen to it on the podcast so that I can actually listen to it while I garden sometimes. Now that the weather's getting better, it's so much fun to listen. Margaret Roach has been writing about gardening for much longer than this, about 30 years. And in her previous life, she was a garden editor at Newsday, and then for Martha Stewart, where she was the first garden editor of Living magazine, and later editorial director of Martha's Magazine's books and website. And I brought, because I subscribe, thanks to Martha, this month's Living has a really wonderful 4 or 5 page spread about Margaret and her home upstate, which shows, I love the pictures of it in all the seasons. That would be my dream, is to have a garden that looks good all the time, right? Just like this one. But recommended, and it just came 2 days ago, and I was so excited to see the essay in there. Today she's here to share her fascinating journey from beginner garden in her backyard to gardening guru, as well as the unique approach she calls horticultural how-to and woo-woo. As fans know, Margaret is their trusty guide to organic practices. She shares so much: when it's safe to start sowing your seeds, how to harvest and store your vegetables, what tools to use, stop using chemicals, stop mowing, at least, a little bit, or where you can. And about insects, she says, we have to resist the wish to squish. And birds, we learned from her, are our teachers. Finally, if you follow Margaret, you know that for her, gardening is meditation and was her first spiritual practice. We need more voices like hers, reminding us, as she does, that gardening is a humbling experience that teaches us that there are so many more larger forces at work than the ones that we can control as human beings. The notion of gardening as a never-ending journey, a lifelong learning process, was the inspiration for this year's series, our series here, The Education of a Gardener. So I can't think of a better speaker to bring us back full circle. Join me in giving a warm garden welcome to Margaret Roach.
I wrote down some thoughts because this is a very special place to speak. A special place for me to speak, but for many plants people over many generations. And it really, NYBG has a history of personal inspiration for many of us and many people who are not here, of course. And so it's where, as a beginning gardener many decades ago, patient souls like Mike Ruggiero and Moby Weinstein answered all my questions, which were incessant, and taught me the basics of green side up, which wasn't always so obvious at first. And it's where Wayne K. Hilly, one of the arborists at that time, took me up a tree. He loaned me all the gear, the arborist gear, and took me way, way up a tree, the first and only time I've been that high up in a tree. And where Dennis Stevenson, who curated the cycads, he toured me through the conservatory, and in telling me about the history of these really primitive plants, used the expression motile male gametes, which turns out to be plant sperm, by the way. So I've learned so much from the scientists and the horticulturists here, and so this is a really happy place for me to be. A happy place for me to be is out in the garden. Mine is still under some snow at the moment. So today's presentation, let's see. Oh, the slides are not advancing. Okay, that's always a bad sign. Okay, let's see if it works on. Might need a rescue. Maybe it's turned off again. You know, I've gone to speak at places and the audience has been in their seats and we're getting started, and then the projector bulb has burned out. That's the worst one of all. You can't work around that. This I can probably use the keyboard. Thank you. Yay. So the title of the talk is Nonstop Plants, the 365-Day Garden. And you're like, Margaret, you live in Zone 5B. There can be frost in June, and there can be frost again in late September. What are you talking about? So we're going to talk about that. But really what I want to tell you is kind of a love story, a 32 or 33-year-long love story. I was a weekend gardener. I bought this little place in Copake Falls, New York, which, by the way, is open a number of times a year for Garden Conservancy open days, and I have all the dates on a flyer outside. I hope you'll come visit in May, June, or August. But I bought this place, and for many years, 21 years specifically, I drove back and forth. You know, I'd leave the city on a Friday afternoon, increasingly earlier and all the time, and try to stretch the weekends till Monday morning. But I'd drive north 120 miles, and I'd be reunited with my beloved garden. And then on Sunday night, or maybe Monday morning, if I was lucky in a given week, we'd be torn asunder. And then the next week, reunited and torn asunder and reunited and torn asunder. And it just went on, and I drove lots of cars into the ground doing that routine. And 11 years ago, it was 11 years in December, I said, you know what, enough is enough. I have to really be with the garden. I'm getting too old, and I'm going to miss it. I've missed so much. So I want to tell you this love story. It's always a beautiful day in the garden, in my opinion. And so, for instance, even in a monochrome of a day, a snow-covered day, this is looking out my back window, uphill to the south. That hollow in the middle is a fish pond, a frog pond, or actually no fish. And that pointed thing in the middle is an Indonesian, an old Indonesian bust of a Buddha who kind of plays hide and seek with me all winter, going in and out of snow cover. So even here in this monochrome, there's beauty. There's sensual curves, there's shadow play. Someone has taken a walk overnight in the fresh snow down the hill. I don't know who. So there's always beauty in the garden. You know, you wake up one winter morning and you look up at that winter blue sky. There's nothing like it in this. The moon is still in the sky, and there's a tracery of fresh snow on the branches. A beautiful day in the garden. Again, just out the window one morning after a snowfall, just at a pair of chairs and a bit of magnolia branch. In the fall, one of my favorite times of year, even looking out that same window, there's that pool down there in the bottom, sort of looking out that same window, but from an elevated spot, out at the kind of amorphic shape by unmowing a little piece of the upper hillside that I've made. I could be happy just looking at this. Not a lot of flowers, there's some goldenrod up in the upper field, but really there's not much, quote, color. There's just green, but look at the textures and the scale of the different leaves and so forth. So I could be happy just with this if we never had any, pretty flowers, quote unquote, in the whole year. Uh-oh. Are there ophidiophobia in the room? I see. Well, I'm a recovering one. To me, part of the incredible thing about gardening is that we get to not only share it with the plants, but also with the creatures that live in the spaces that we garden. I'm a recovering ophidiophobia, and I live in a place where we also have eastern timber rattlers in the garden, so one does have to be cautious, and I know now you really want to come visit me because I've shared that little detail with you. But this is just a garter snake. And, I was really afraid of snakes, and that's not a great thing for a gardener, especially an organic gardener, to be. It's kind of self-defeating. And when I moved upstate, as I said, 11 years ago, full-time, it was in the winter, and my friends and family were very concerned about the potential downward progression of my mental health with this new decision I had made. And a few months into it, as spring sprung, they sent my best friend Erica up to check out my mental status. And she was very polite. She stayed for a weekend, and she was very polite, didn't ask too many questions. But every time I would go out the door, apparently I was alarming her, because this is what I would do. I would swing open the door. I would look carefully, and then I'd walk around outside almost like this. And Erica said, you seem okay. Except what's with the stomping? And I was like, well, it's the snakes. They have no ears, Erica, but they have a hinged lower jaw, and it vibrates, and when you stomp, it vibrates, and that's how they hear, and then they go away, and you don't have to see the snakes. That's a direct quote, by the way. And she was like, okay, I guess that kind of makes sense. She goes, and she was a newspaper photographer for Miami Herald and Newsday for decades. And she said, I have an idea. She said, when I used to be assigned to crime scenes or natural disasters, I didn't want to get out of the car, let alone take a picture, she said early in her career. She said, so what I did is I put the longest lens on my camera when I first arrived, and I took pictures from a long, safe distance, and I gradually put on shorter lenses and worked my way into the scene. She said, why don't you use your binoculars and look at snakes, and then eventually your telephoto lens and look at snakes and take pictures. And don't you know, it desensitized me and made me unafraid. Now look at the fractal geometry, nature's geometry just in the skin of that snake. I mean, look at the incredible detail in a snake and how it's constructed and how it functions. So she was really right to help me to get over my fear. Plus, snakes are great, as are these guys, great helpers in natural pest control. Oh, sorry, I went too far. This is my ex-husband. You see, you thought you were going to hear Latin names, and I'm just going to tell jokes, basically, but I will get to the plants. But he's not very tall, but great eyes, right? But seriously, reptiles and amphibians, like, we as gardeners need to be protecting the lower layers of the food chain, fortifying them, respecting them, caring for them. In the soil, life is so much that sustains everything on the planet, and these little guys will help with the pesky stuff. But if we nuke stuff, if we fertilize, I don't even use so-called natural or organic products, but if we do bad things to the lower layer of the food chain, we're not really helping. So I'd rather have frogs and snakes and dragonflies to help with pest control and birds So birds especially are one of my things, and it was mentioned before that I say that birds taught me to garden, and I really think that they did. I didn't know much about them when I started all those decades ago. That's just a first-year rose-breasted grosbeak sitting in a leaf in the backyard. And I have about 68 to 70 species of birds that visit the garden each year, because what I did when I first got there was I realized I liked birds. I saw birds that I'd never seen growing up in Queens and in this rural place. And I thought, how can I attract more? And I started doing so, and we'll see some of the ways that I did that in a minute. But the birds really showed me kind of how things work, what nature's natural system is, and they just generally delighted me. So it was already mentioned that my philosophy is don't rush to crush, or you've got to resist the wish to squish. I try to come up with memorable ways to tell you this. How dare we really decide that this creature who's eating this canna leaf in this picture and pooping on it, no less, how dare I decide that this is an unworthy creature that needs to be killed if I don't even know what it is? If I don't even know who it is, who it's going to be, or and so forth, what its life cycle is. So I say, when you see insects outside, when you see creatures in general outside that you don't recognize, go inside. This is what Google is really good for. Go inside and find out. Black and white furry caterpillar. Go inside and find out who it is. It's a tussock moth. And what they do, and who eats them, and what they eat, and what they're doing here, and so forth, and where they fit in. I find this is the most fascinating part for me of gardening, especially these years. Of course, caterpillars also have an advantage. Caterpillars are the sort of the baby food of the songbird set. Without caterpillars, if we didn't have an abundance of caterpillars, not hairy ones like that so much as some of the little kind of green guys high up in the trees in spring, we wouldn't have as many songbird babies fledging successfully. It's what most songbird species feed to their young, is insects, and especially the soft-bodied caterpillars. So we gotta love moths because that's where they come from, or butterflies, but lots and lots of moths. So I've become kind of, because of my love of birds, because of my curiosity fueled by the birds, I ended up learning about moths and wanting to feed the birds and grow lots of moths. And it turns out I've already photographed almost 200 species in my garden that I'm able to identify. There's probably a little over 1,000. I don't know that I'll get to 1,000, but look at them. Do you even know a moth in your yard? Do you know any? Does anyone even? You know what I mean? We don't even look because most of them are out after dark. So this is my current obsession, and something else that the birds led me to. And look at how nature is. I mean, if we slow down and really take some time out there, not just frantically going around, oh, I gotta mow the lawn, I gotta prune, I gotta edge, I gotta mulch, our chores. Walking one September in the yard, maybe two Septembers ago, I saw this twig, right? That's a twig. It's a part of an Aeschylus parviflora, Battlebush buckeye. Except the thing on the left is a twig, and the thing on the right is a caterpillar. A stick caterpillar, well named, but probably a geometrid moth of some kind. And it is displaying for us this disguise mechanism in nature, crypsis, being cryptic, being hidden, being unseen, a survival mechanism against predation. So let the garden open you up to learning a little bit of science. Let the garden make you ask questions, not just about what looks pretty with what perennials go together or whatever. Let's go beyond that. I've been gardening for a very long time, as you can see. These are my standard chrysanthemums that I was disbudding all the way and covering with black cloth at night. They're actually my grandmother. She was a garden club lady, and she did show her mums in shows and stuff in the fall. And I grew up in Queens, as I said, where the gardens are the proverbial springtime riot of color, kind of psychedelic. I think they got me orange pants because I didn't have red hair like my sister, so that we could kind of match. And so you'd think that this would be the kind of inspiration visually, aesthetically, that I would have when I bought my little house upstate. And of course, this is not it. This is Powis Castle, one of my favorite gardens in the world in Wales. And the thing about Powis Castle that speaks to me is that in, I don't know, the year 1200 and something, there was no castle there. And there was this lower valley floor down below where the browning grass is. And there was this place up on the hill where the castle is now perched. And the lord of the manor to be sort of said to the serfs, hey, carve me some terraces, 1, 2, 3, I think there's 5 terraces, to fortify the castle that we're building, right? So that invaders aren't going to come in and get us. Over the centuries since, this has become this incredible garden. If you could garden a site like this, you know, precipitous, incline and so forth, I figure I could garden my little place on a hillside. Now, I love those yews, which are hundreds of years old, up above like big giant gumdrops. And the workers actually go up on these enormous ladders and, you know, like for the whole day and do their pruning. I mean, can you imagine? But centuries of age in those plants. So the little dump that I bought 30-something years ago in Quebec Falls, this was the day I first came in the driveway with the real estate person, and there was the former owner. I think maybe he should have mowed the lawn or something first, but whatever. This is what it looked like. It was just this like white box, this little 600 square foot on the floor, white box, Victorian era, sitting on a hillside. And I got rid of the whiteness of it, made it more dark so that it was sort of heavier and it would have a little more presence, and got rid of a lot of the lawn too pretty quick. Now, in this picture, there's purple and gold, and my house is dark olive and has orange trim, and you might say, yikes, I don't really think those colors go together, or that's kind of screaming. But you know what? That's my garden. Don't let anybody tell you that pink and yellow don't go together, or whatever. If you want to make a red, white, and blue garden, or you only want to have silver, pink, pale pink, and white, so be it. Like, in nature, the color palettes are much more varied. I mean, look inside some of the orchids or other tropical flowers. Look at the plumage of a tropical bird. Look at a sunset. Look at the colors that nature combines. You can put anything together. I happen to love gold foliage, maybe to a fault. So this is my thing, you know, in the spring in the front yard. From the back, from that hillside behind the house that we saw in snow, there's the Buddha, there's his little pond. There's a few 365-day plants in this picture, the espaliered Asian pear on the back of the house in flower here, but really beautiful, even naked all winter long, like a flat sculpture. The gold Hinoki cypress on the right, the Chamaecyparis obtusa cripsii, which I love, love, love. This space here, maybe 30 feet by 20 feet, is the only flat spot on 2.3 acres. Everything else is kind of like, don't leave a full wheelbarrow unattended. So this is a special little place, and to make the house, as I said, more important and not just this tiny little white box, I've painted it, as I mentioned before, dark. Also, over the years, added stone around it, so it's sort of heavier, it has more presence, even though it's still the same little house that it was. Now, I don't show you this to show you that I'm a bad housekeeper who doesn't know how to vacuum up Asian lady beetles, which at this time of year where I live, we're besieged with. But I show you this because I'm not a garden designer, but I know that the most important thing that we do as real gardeners is that we need to go inside before we plant something or prune something or make any big decisions on siting anything in the garden or even the shape of a bed or the scale of a bed. We need to go inside and look out the window, because it really is different being out there in the garden versus inside. And to my mind, when I'm outside, I'm mostly crawling around doing something. I'm not standing there going, oh, this is fabulous, this is fabulous. I'm engaged with it. But when I get to go inside later and I'm making my supper, or in the morning I'm making my tea, that's when I savor the fruit of my labors. So go inside and get the perspective. This is looking to the west past a patio, and I'll show you that. So again, out the window, and this is before things have sort of come up in the spring. But I added on right angle from the house sort of a gravel patio. And I'll show you that, like there. You can see how steep the ground is because even though this is a little under 20 feet wide, it's almost a 4-foot change in grade from the top where it fades into the earth to this corner here where the pansy pots are. So, you know, I thought I needed when I moved up full time, I thought I needed an outdoor dining area, someplace to sit. Let's just count how many times I've actually, that would be 0. But it looks good. And again, it sort of makes the house feel more important, almost like the ruin of maybe a second building or something like that. So I have this sort of thing. I anthropomorphize the year in the garden, you know, into 6 seasons. I kind of liken them to the seasons of my own human life. In January and February, the season of conception, where we conceive of the garden to come, and go right through death and afterlife in November and December. And I want to explain that. So to me, you know, gardening, it's not like the garden and the gardener. 2 separate things. You know, I think of it as like this organism that we have become. And I think of it, you know, like that movie, Jerry Maguire, and he tortures Renee Zellweger throughout the movie, and then finally he runs into like the women's group near the end and he says, "You complete me." That's how I feel like the garden is, and hopefully that the garden is for me, is that it's, you know, that it feels about me, that you know, it's where I express myself, it's where I figure things out, it's where I'm most inspired, it's where I learn. It's taught me science, it's given me a window into life, the life cycle, it's given me a place of solace, it's given me so much. So again, you complete me, the garden and the gardener, one organism. Sometimes it makes your heart bleed, like if it doesn't rain for 3 months or it rains every day for 3 months. And sometimes you need to have a heart of stone, like my mobile out by the door, hanging in a tree by the door. You need to have a heart of stone to sort of carry on, because some years, especially lately, the so-called weather is pretty unpredictable. So again, I think of it, anthropomorphize the year into 2-month segments. The season of conception, when you plant on paper inside, you order seeds. If the snow melts in my raised beds in February, I might put on my mittens and throw some spinach seeds, or for that matter, poppy seeds, or other things that like some cold, the last bit of the cold. So the season of conception, the season of birth in March and April, where the first things come alive, the hamamelis, the intermediate hamamelis, for me would be early. Sometimes those will even happen in February now. And the first perennial to bloom is always the Christmas rose, the Helleborus niger. And the season of youth in May and June, everything is growing so fast. And, you know, those hosta shoots like out of the ground, and they're so sharp and insistent looking, and how in the world did they ever manage where, you know, I get to -6 and -10 all the time at night, and how did they stay frozen down there and then have all that energy to push through? And on the left-hand side, the picture of those sort of covered flower heads still in their papery coverings. That's not a picture you'll see in the bulb catalog under Nectaroscortum siculum or Allium bulgaricum or whatever the heck it's called, but an allium cousin that I love, that it has dangling bells, and we'll see them later, kind of mauve and greenish, and kind of a honey scent, and the bees love it. But maybe it's thigh high. But I love this moment in the season of youth, in the life cycle of that plant, of that Nectaroscortum, because it looks to me like 2 young lovers with their little heads kind of resting against each other, you know. So what I'm trying to say is, let's not just look for the big blue hydrangeas. Let's not just look for, you know, the rose garden in full bloom. Those are fantastic things, but that's not every day. And as good a gardener as I am, I can't make those things happen out of their season. So savor every drop. Let's be excited about the papery covering of the Nectaroscortum too, or the sharp shoots of the hosta. It's July and August, the season of adulthood, when Margaret has planted too many beans and not pick them often enough, and they're useless except for making vegetable stock. Or the time of Angelica gigas, the Korean biennial Angelica that I love so much, that gets about up to my nose or a little taller in the semi-shady areas. There it is in the garden. With the biennials in the early spring and then again in the fall, I find the seedlings that will flower next year and I move them around. With biennials, you kind of have to manage the colonies. Like, these didn't just do this perfect thing that year. I moved the babies around to have that kind of a look. And the season then in September, October of winding down. In human life, that's called the senescence. Senescence is when we're not proliferating new fresh cells, we're not growing, we're sort of declining. The season of life that I'm at now, more days behind me than ahead of me. But it's also a very rich time up on the hill, looking out into the hills beyond. The winding down, I love the senescence season. Nothing lasts, big lesson that the garden teaches us if we wish to hear it. Nothing lasts. So just like we celebrate the crab apples coming into bloom, why don't we celebrate, pink pools of petals beneath them as well, beautiful in its own way? Why don't we celebrate not just the Japanese maple this came from, but when it litters the ground with this gold beauty? Celebrate this too, so celebrate the passings. And sometimes celebrate the passings by not taking out things like a dying tree. This old birch, two massive trunks, very, very large in my backyard, started to die from the top down. It was losing its head, and in storms, big pieces were flying around near the house. And I didn't want to take it down because this creature was born here. This creature has lived its life here. It's a venerable old soul, and it's also tons and tons of biomass, living biomass. It deserves to die here and to feed back, to go back into the ground here. Plus it has all kinds of havens and so forth for every kind of creature imaginable. So I had it topped kind of. I couldn't leave more, which I would have liked to do, but I turned it into a wildlife tree or a snag. The rest of the carcass, not the brushy part, but the rest of the carcass is lying below it where it's decaying. The number of birds that visit it, the number of mammals that visit it, the insects, it's incredible. So it's really important, I think, that we leave these older members of our community standing as long as it's a safe place, as long as it's not a hazard to anyone. And so in the season of death and afterlife in November and December, I don't clean up the garden like I'm vacuuming the living room, from one corner to the next, to the other. I don't do everything. I sort of pick it apart according to what I aesthetically want to see left up a little longer for my own delight visually, and also for what the birds especially can pick over and get seeds off. And so, for instance, that's Hakanakloa macra, all gold, a nice Japanese forest grass, maybe knee-high or so. And what I love, it has that sort of wave on the beach splashing kind of structure the plant does. And I leave it up until a few snowstorms collapse it. I love looking at it like that, like the movement of it like that, and then the wheat color underneath the snow. So don't clean up too soon in the season of death and afterlife. And it's also the time, no matter what kind of our spiritual pursuits, it's the time that I'm always sifting compost and moving the oldest finished stuff out into the beds, taking out the sticks and stones. When I first began gardening upstate, before I began gardening upstate, maybe this is going back 40 years, my first garden, I was called home. My father had died 1 year when I was in my early 20s, and then a year or so later, I was called home by my sister, who was living with our mother in the house we grew up in Douglaston, Queens, and she said, "Something's wrong with Mommy, can you come home? I need help." And so I came home, and long story short, it turned out my mother, who was 49 at the time, had early onset Alzheimer's disease. And so what happened is that I became the person who moved home with her for the first, 4 or 5 years before she finally couldn't live at home anymore. And we had people help and so forth, and I went to work at night at the New York Times, but during the day I was home. I was on duty, so to speak. So this was the second half of my 20s. And you can only watch so much daytime television, let me tell you. So thankfully I discovered James Underwood Crockett's Victory Garden book and some Sunset Garden books and the Taylor Guides, and I don't even know who gave me my first one. And I started ordering bulbs and going to the local nursery and cutting down the privet hedge around the edge of the property and doing all these experiments. Horticultural therapy I was performing on myself. Does anyone find the garden to be kind of a refuge? Yeah, so for me, it's always been that. It's always been that place, again, that you complete me thing. One of the things I got in those days, perennials were sold even in sort of like 6-packs or 4-packs. They didn't cost $25 a piece. You could get littler ones of some things, and you picked what you liked by the little, remember those pixie stick, the tiny plastic labels that used to exist, and it had a postage stamp photo. Well, there was a flat or a cell pack or something of these, of Nyphophia, the red hot poker plant or whatever else it's called. There was at the local garden center, and I thought, oh, that looks interesting. I had no idea what it was. And I bought an equal number of these and Sempervivum, or hens and chicks. And I made a little bed by the kitchen door. Someone's already laughing. And I made this bed. And like a mathematician with a piece of graph paper, I put one of these and one hen and chick and one of these. And on the next row, I did the opposite and down the row. And that was my first garden. And I didn't know anything about either plant or what they needed or if they were good companions or how big they got or anything. And it was horrible, of course. But I'm still at it. You have to grow it to know it. You have to kill it probably also to figure it out. I've never grown this guy again. But it is a great plant. I mean, Great Dixter makes good use of this plant in England, for instance. When I got the place upstate, it had this beat-up old barn with like a tree growing through it, fully air-conditioned. And it had a couple of old sheds that were off their sills and rotted. That did have a Japanese moss garden on the roof of one. And, my friends and we repaired them and made them into cabins, little cottages that could put the house plants out beside and so forth. But my friends in the city were like, why don't you move to the Hamptons? Why don't you get a weekend place in the Hamptons? And I was like, ugh, not the Hamptons. No. I wanted to go somewhere rural. And I kept saying, that it had outbuildings. There were outbuildings and how charming it was. And they were like, ah! But anyway, it also had a bunch of old lilacs, I think 2 or 3 of them that went up to the second-story window. This is a picture taken 30-something years ago when I first saw the place, as you can see, unmown lawn. But there's this century-old lilac, 2 stories high, and it's like a thicket, right? And I looked in the book on how to, quote, rejuvenate a flowering shrub, right? And what does it say? Cut out 1/3 of the oldest branches to the ground every year for the next 3 years, and you'll rejuvenate it. So this would turn into a little blob, right? But when I went inside and looked, it was these incredible gnarled lichen-covered trunks. I couldn't cut those 1/3 of those down to the ground every year and make a little blob out of it. It was, again, over a century old. Now, by the way, this is a moment in the foreground here of the life of a hosta that you should not celebrate. And that's why I have an 8-foot deer fence around the whole place. But anyway, I instead of doing the, quote, rejuvenation, and this is where when we're pruning, we need to think, is this an old creature, a distinguished citizen? What am I going to do? Am I going to follow the rules, or am I going to think first and stand back and really feel your way through it? I decided to spare these ancient lilacs. If I hadn't, they would have, again, been upright little things. They would never again in my lifetime have dripped like that, their arms outstretched, right? So I just feel like we have to have respect when we're pruning. So I got some upright lilacs, which now are big, by the way, and this is apple blossom time. But let's take away the lilac flowers and let's take away the apple blossoms from this picture, and let's say that there's no flowers at all. Why is it still a beautiful day in the garden in this picture? And I would say it's the light. It's like this God light, this incredible light we have in the Hudson Valley. I think it's beautiful light. But if, and the west is, this is an afternoon picture, the west is to the left, far left of this picture. If I had put a bunch of big conifers in that far left corner of the property, when I moved there, I would not have this light. So the other thing we have to do when we're looking out the window and thinking before we make any moves is we have to follow the light, and we have to see how it moves around the place and try to take advantage of it. So I love the light. There were 5, again, century-old apples on the place. They were covered with multiflora rose, wild grape, oriental bittersweet. You couldn't see them at all, and they had so many suckers. It was just unbelievable. This one is over 40 feet wide and 30 feet tall. It's probably about 130 years old, 140 years old now. Still fruits heavily. In all the books that I had at that time, it said, and the people at the local nursery said, standard apples, the old types, not so disease resistant, alternate bearers, every other year a crop, too tall, too big to prune, too tall, too big to pick from. Cut them down. Get a semi-dwarf, Margaret. That's what they said. I'm in a 7,000-acre state park. My land is surrounded by it, with several thousand agricultural acres across the road from me, not part of the park. I'm in an open, big land. And they told me to get semi-dwarf apples. And no. So this guy survived. They all survived, and we prune them obviously every year, and they reward me with fruit. So again, when you're working with old creatures, it's a lot different approach than what's in the book, I think. I mean, that right hand, that circular trunk, the one that's going up to the right, is much wider than my body, to give you the perspective. This is a massive old tree. And if I had cut them down and gotten the little blobs, I would never see their silhouettes against the winter sky, and I wouldn't enjoy these enormous clouds like they're in the distance of flowers each year in the spring. Nor would I have had the best place ever for putting ephemerals and really, really early bulbs, early little things, tucking them into the root system. This is one of the old apples just about to break into flower, and beneath it are hellebores, trilliums, violets, minor bulbs, whatever. And that gold thing we'll talk about later, that's Hylamicum japonicum, an Asian ephemeral. And I'll explain that later. But when you're working under old trees or trees that are well rooted, work with tiny little baby plants, right? Don't get your shovel out. I work with like the equivalent of a tablespoon or my finger. It takes a long time to make it look good, but it's worth it because you don't disturb the roots. So anyway, wonderful place for springtime extra show. And if life deals you apples, you make applesauce. And in my pajamas and, sweatshirt and rubber boots and haven't brushed my hair, I'm out collecting the windfalls of my too tall to pick from apples. So you wait till they drop. The place also came with this blob of a rhododendron, and you saw the azaleas and so forth in the psychedelic garden of my youth at my parents' house. And, I didn't think much about rhododendrons at the time. And this was sort of sitting in the middle of the backyard, and that's exactly what it looked like the first day that I saw it bloom. And I didn't know what to do with it. But the good news was I did follow the rules in the book with this one, and it said, the first year in a new garden, don't make any permanent decisions with your woody plants. Don't cut anybody down the first year because you don't really know what the whole cycle of the season is going to look like. So instead, in the moving van I brought with me from the garden I'd been making at my mother's, a young plant, I put it in a bushel basket actually, a young plant of a Cyadopetus verticillata, the Japanese umbrella pine. And I put it to the left of the rhodie, which you can see there. And to the right I put a dwarf white pine. They were very small at the time. And and dug a little pool, not the pool you saw, but a different one, my first pool. In between them, and they've just been really super happy together. Now, I would say that I brought that Cyadopetus there, which everyone says is really hard to get acclimated. I didn't even know what zone I was moving to, so I got really, really, really lucky. And now, and the rhodie thanks me every year by doing this sort of Japanese cherry blossom festival for me, dropping its petals to celebrate. And that's what is celebrated in the Sakura Matsuri is the Cherry Blossom Festival. It's not peak bloom that's celebrated. You go out and you put your blankets down and picnic underneath the trees when they're shattering. And what is that about? It's to take note of the ephemeral nature of all precious and living things. Nothing lasts. It's a nothing lasts Carpe Diem festival. So the roadie gives me the Carpe Diem thing. It shatters, but it makes this beautiful moment in the pool, sends its flowers into the pool. So there's the Cyadopetus grown up and against the winter sky. So good old plant. The first pool was only 18 inches deep. Who knew that my frost line is 4+ feet? So we dug the bigger one that you saw before, and this is when, how it looks in close up. Sedum in the cracks, and lots of myriophyllum, the parrot feather perennial in the water, and floating plants like duckweed or lemna on top to shade the water so I don't get string algae. And this is the other kind of thing that happens, and that I was all those years rushing past. I was rushing up on the weekends and rushing back and rushing and rushing and rushing, always with the chores. How many times did I miss things like that? She climbed as a female green frog. She climbed up 4 feet. She sat on his shoulder. She told him something for about 20 minutes, and then she turned right around and slowly climbed back down into the water. These are the moments in the garden. Again, every day is beautiful. No flowers in this picture, but still a beautiful day in the garden. I also, to sort of tell you there'll be water in the garden beyond, when you first walk up the path, I have seasonal pots of water there, which the little frogs really like, and again, covered to shade the water so it doesn't get the algae. Big troughs, terracotta troughs, and a place for me to put out my house plants. The best 365-day plants of all are your house plants put into seasonal duty outside. And so I don't know how many of you picked up that handout thing, but I want to bang through some plants, some plant ideas, because what I've been talking about a little bit is how what we want to do is not expect, again, the big blue hydrangeas or the full bloom rose garden every day of the year. We want to kind of open ourselves up to savoring every drop, to appreciating all of the things, all of the living things out there, the fascination of every insect, of everything that's going on, every moment in the life of each plant. And to celebrate the passings as well. But we need some good plants to accomplish this. And so what I've done is I've kind of grouped them on this handout that you have. I kind of mentioned how I shop for plants, and especially now later in my gardening career. So here's what I want you to do is, before we start with the plant list, is I want you to promise that when the garden center opens, ours is opening in the Berkshires up near me this weekend, when you go to the garden center this spring, close your eyes when you get out of your car and walk past all the stuff they've put out that's in bloom. And go inside to the counter and say, where's the stuff that looked good in February and will look good in November? Don't buy any more spring stuff. Come on, who doesn't have spring already? Doesn't everybody have spring color? Don't we all have spring color? So we need to, first of all, start shopping for different times of year. As I say on the handout, ephemerals and other really early birds to stretch the season backwards. An army of the sort of soldiers, like plants that do long, long, long solid duty. It's okay to have some of what I call the imperfect but irresistible types, but you can't have those things that look good for 2 minutes. Too many of those, you can't make a garden out of them. And then some real powerhouse plants that have really 4-season interest. This is one of my favorite peas, by the way, bred by an old hippie out in Corvallis, Oregon, called Alan Capular. His kids carry on the business called Peace Seedlings, and it's sugar magnolia. It's a sugar snap, edible potted pea, but it has rich in anthocyanins, the pigments that are supposed to be so good for us, but are also just plain beautiful. So I start in my favorite colors, red, gold, purple. I group the plants that way. And I start with a ground cover, which the minute the snow finishes melting and we get a couple of warm days, like a week or so of warmth, I'll have this one, Pulmonaria rubra, sometimes sold as red start. It's one of the lungworts, the pulmonarias, that doesn't have silver splashed leaves. You probably know the ones with blue flowers or pink flowers and mottled or even whitish silver leaves. And those are great, but I like this one better, and the reason is, how many of you can name a red flowering perennial that blooms at the time of the early daffodils, the early other bulbs like snowdrops, etc.? When you have mostly white and yellow in the garden, you know, I think red is a great thing to have at that time, and so Pulmonaria rubra gives you that. Makes an easy ground cover. So I said you can't make a garden out of one-trick ponies, the imperfect, irresistible types. This is a mardigan lily named Claude Schride, and the mardigans, European species, they come in many colors. The flowers are small, but there's many, many of them on a stem and on a plant. So they're really beautiful when they bloom, but you can't make a garden out of lilies. So make sure you have good stuff at its feet and around it. This is just a little moment. I love red, as I said, and so I wanted red in all the layers of the garden, the intermediate layer like those lilies, the ground layer like that Pulmonaria rubra, even vertical, higher up. This is a detail of the flower of Lonicera sempervirens, one of our southern United States honeysuckles that the hummingbirds love. And even I was able to indulge my red thing in a tree, a small tree, Aesculus pavia, the red buckeye or something like that. I don't know what its common name is, but Aesculus pavia. And so up on the hill, and these are really, really long inflorescences, wonderful, startling kind of a small tree. You can also get red, if you love red as I do, in fruit. I wouldn't recommend this one anymore. This is the double file viburnum, Plicatum tomentosum, but and it does get great fruit. It gets its fruit in, like, for me, late July, August-ish, which the birds and small mammals quickly take. The reason I wouldn't recommend it anymore is this one's proving to be invasive, and so it's seeding all into our woodlands like so many things are. So it's not one I would add now. I'd go with probably some of the native species or but my point in showing this picture, because this one's so prevalent in our gardens, is that the fruit in oh, what's that? Does anyone know what that is? We're just I hope I didn't trigger that. So my point, what is it? Does anyone know what it is? Okay. It's a phone? Okay. So what I was going to say is that if we want to extend the season, even if we were looking for fruit to extend the season, and even if we were narrowing it farther and saying, I'm just wanting viburnums for fruit, red fruit in my case, even if you just shopped under V in a woody plant catalog or asked to see the viburnums in your local garden center, even shopping smartly in such a narrow range as the genus Viburnum, you can have fruit in the late summer, or you could have fruit like in Viburnum satigerum, the tea viburnum, that will hold on until maybe after the new year. Birds don't seem to be very interested in this one. It's not a native one. So when you're shopping, again, even in one genus, stretch the season, do your homework, ask the questions. Don't just, like the label will say, spring flowers, fall fruit, fall color. When? Like fall fruit can be August or it can be October. And again, in some of them like satigerum, not satigerum. Help me, Marco, are you out there? Is T. viburnum satigerum, is that right? Yeah, it is. Okay, sorry. I knew someone is here who's grown this plant. So stretch your season. Shop with stretching the season in mind. Crab apples are great four-season plants, or at least multi-season plants. I have 8 or 10 of the small fruited ones that the birds start taking all the fruit in the fall. But I selfishly have a couple of Ralph Shea, this one that has a crab apple that's about, I don't know, 1.25 inches or so big. And I say selfishly because the birds can't figure out what to do with this one in the fall. So I get to look at the fruit for months and months and months. And then as it's frozen and thawed, throughout the winter, around February, the birds will come, like a flock of robins will come, cedar waxwings, etc., and they'll peck at that fruit that's been softened by the temperature changes, and it'll shatter, and then they'll all be underneath eating it. So it all gets eaten by birds. It's just it gets timed, and Margaret gets to enjoy Ralph Shea for a few months. Ralph Shea, that's just a young plant, is the white-flowered one, and Prairie Fire and Candy Mint and a lot of other ones. Malbec Reaper and a lot of other ones are on the hillside. The best thing that I did when I met the birds in those early years and tried to find out what birds liked was I planted about 50 winterberry holly plants around the perimeter of the property in some groups, Ilex verticillata. And boy, that brings in the birds like crazy. It also, during flowering time, brings in a lot of pollinators. So this is a great native shrub, but it's not a pretty four-season shrub, so don't line your front walk with winterberry hollies. Again, I have 50 mature ones. I love this plant, but I wouldn't put it right by the house in the most conspicuous spot. It's boring most of the year, except at this time. Plant some big islands of it if you can. Excuse me, even say you have a hedge at the far perimeter of your property, come in 8 feet or 6 feet, and in front of the hedge, plant some of these so that there's like a long distance view to this beautiful sort of Christmas display. So I love the Ilex verticillata for their power on the birds and also just for beautifying the garden at a time when there's not much else. I use kind of, decorative items like these chairs. I have them in several colors that I move around to spice up areas. But more important, in the far distance there are some perennials that I really love that do their thing in the late season. That purple thing that's about 5 feet tall and about 8 feet across in the distance is bush clover, Lespedeza thunbergii. I always forget at least one in the process of doing this. And it doesn't even start happening until September. So that's a great surprise for the late season. Again, I'm not just shopping for spring things anymore. And it's in front of a 10 or 12 or even 13, 14-foot wall of Miscanthus giganteus. Behind that wall of ornamental grass in the top left corner, it hides my compost heap and the work areas of the garden and the far gate. So it's like a living wall in season. My favorite color, as I confessed earlier, is gold, especially gold leaves. I love gold flowers too, especially in the spring, and I'm waiting. I had my first open flower yesterday of the Aranthus, the winter aconite. Great to have these or pussy willows, especially because pussy willows would be natives. This is not a native, but nectar and pollen sources for early awakening pollinators to stretch our season, not just for our visual enjoyment, but for their benefit as well, as you can see. So Aranthus hyemalis. And I mentioned that under the apple tree before. I said there was this Hylamicon japonicum, this Asian ephemeral, and that I would mention it later. And this is my hubris plant. This is the plant that taught me about hubris, about arrogance. I bought it many, many years ago, probably 20 years ago at a rare plant sale, and it was not in any catalogs or anything then, not in the nurseries, not available. And I felt so proud because I had it and you didn't. And I mean, do you have something like that in your life where, do you know what I mean? I mean, even if we're not really arrogant to a fault, you know what I mean? Where we feel special, we pat ourselves on the back because we have something different from others. Well, I was so selfish with this plant, as my friends Charles Price and Glenn Withey from Seattle pointed out to me. They said, "You're so selfish with this plant, you don't even share it with yourself." I had this one plant, it sat there every year in late April-ish. It would start to bloom, and I would go out like it was a shrine. "Hello, plant, you're such a good plant. I'm such a good person because I have you and no one else has you." Anyway, ridiculous. So Charles and Glenn came and taught me the most important lesson of my life. These are world-class garden designers, these two people. But this is one of the best things I ever learned from them. That's Charles. And he said, I was in the backyard and doing something, and he was in the front yard. And I came around to the front where my plant was, and Charles was standing there, and there was a hole. And he's about 6'3" or so, and he's in this damn yellow rain suit, looking very imposing. And he has a grafting knife or a garden knife, and he's cutting the rootstock of my plant up into tiny little pieces. And I screamed and I cursed and I burst out crying and I ran in the house and I slammed the door, and he came in after me in this rain suit with my plant in his hand, screamed at me, slammed the door and screamed at me. And he said that thing. He said, "You're so selfish with this plant, you don't even share it with yourself." He said, "This is going to be your signature plant of spring." He said, "Move it around, divide it up, be brave, Margaret, dig the damn thing up and spread it around and make it a signature of the garden." So you got to go through this, and here he is. He was doing a hosta at the same time. And you got to go through this, and this is hell. A year later, it just looks like this. It looks like hell. Polka dots and mulch, right? But now I must have 50,000 of this plant. I have rivers of it under everything. So in that moment, it's so incredible for my one plant, because they taught me not to be stingy with things and to be brave and to divide them and move them around. It blooms around the same time as an eastern wildflower, the celandine poppy styloforum diphyllum, and the two of them consorting with that, the beginning of the grass, the Hakanakloa allgold that we saw before under a magnolia. And I even love the gold of an old Carya japonica picta there on the right, with very tiny little variegated white flowers and green stems, even grows in the shade, a real old-fashioned shrub. And I love gold foliage. Why buy the regular version if you can get a gold foliage one, which means my garden is a little bit loud on the eyes. Gold heart dicentra, or the gold version of Coralopsis spicata. This is Aurea, the winter hazel. There's the Hakanakloa all gold. So here's an area leading up to the house that looks good May, June, July, August, September, October, November. 7 months with one cleanup a year. No flowers, but it always looks good. The European ginger, the painted fern, hosta June, etc. Real four-season shrubs, plus great supporters of wildlife. The cornus, the twig willows and twig dogwoods. This is a twig dogwood, silver and gold. That's sunshine, the gold leaf form. Red twigs in the winter, gold flowers, gold leaves in the summer. White flowers and white fruit for pollinators and birds. I'm not big on spireas, but I love ogon, Spirea thunbergii ogon, because it holds its foliage. It's gold foliage. Those are winter berries in the background. They're that red. So right into December, even in my climate, has the usual white frothy flowers, but gold foliage, ogon. I could do a whole lecture about the genus Aurelia. This is one, a woody eastern native called Spinosa, the devil's walking stick, in its fall color, and those big purple trusses that bring in a lot of the thrush relatives, a lot of the birds. And again, when we're talking about fall color, we're shopping and we're asking and we're closing our eyes and moving past the spring things. We're asking at the store when they say, "Oh, it has great fall color." When? September? October? November? Tell me when. I want months of fall color. So let's get more specific and more detailed. Lindera benzoin, our native spice bush, for the edge of a woodland or a semi-shady area, has some of the latest and best fall color for me. Plus, it's a great wildlife plant. A little science curiosity is, for me, why do plants look like what they look like? Why do some plants like this Paeonium lacosavicii, Molly the witch peony, a little species woodland peony, why does it come up out of the ground not green? Why is it painted these anthocyanin-rich colors? Why is it this color? Or why is twin leaf Jeffersonia diphylla not green when it comes up? Or even the bleeding heart not green? And again, go in and do a Google search. Don't just look at it. Wonder, be curious, engage, and learn. And this is what I love. It turns out that these pigments don't taste very good. So if you're going to wake up early, It might be good to not taste good so that the early awakening herbivores who are really hungry after a winter's nap don't eat you. And there's other theories about how it may help them take in more sunshine before the tree canopy, the forest canopy of these woodland plants leaves out and so forth. But at any rate, fascinating lesson just from not green leaves. I love the hellebores, especially the black ones. My favorite primula, nobody sells it except, arrow, not broken arrow, but I'll think of it in a minute anyway. A primula specialist out, I forget, Midwest or something. This is Kisoena, Primula Kisoena is my favorite one, felted blue-green, beautifully shaped leaves. And you need some workhorses, you need tough things. I don't use the usual ground covers, but I love Geranium macrorhizum. It doesn't, it's not invasive, it's easy to pull out, looks good all the time. There's the bud of that Angelica gigas that I showed you before. Even if it never flowered and it just had that little shop of horrors bud, I love this plant. It's as big as my fist, the mature ones. And chrysanthemums, why in the garden centers do they sell us the ones that are the same colors as the fall leaves? You know, rust and maroon and gold. Let's have pink ones and perennial pink ones like Will's Wonderful, or just Sheffield pink, much more common, slightly larger and more subtle. A good word for leaves, I like leaves, especially that are big and bold in texture, Astilboides tabularis, or the biggest of the hostas, big ones like Sege. Who needs flowers when you have the autumn fern, Dryarctos erythrosaura, and the painted fern, the Japanese painted fern? You can make a whole garden of that would look good for 5 months of the year or 6 months. Another one of the twig dogwoods, Cornus sericea, silver and gold, white variegation, and gold twigs in the winter. And there's always stuff arriving by mail at my house, even though I'm not supposed to shop anymore. I used to shop like this. This I don't do anymore. And I used to prep like this with renting a sod stripper and making new beds, and I'm not allowed to do that at all. Mostly now I'm only allowed to tuck more bulbs into beds and layer in little bits and pieces of things. And so we're going to wind down here to a close in the compost heap. It's an open pile, as you can see. The compost heap at my place is about 45 feet long, and in season it's about 7-8 feet tall and about 8-9 feet wide. And it's really this archaeological dig of my life as a gardener. And I love the heap. I love every delivery that I make to it and every withdrawal that I take from it. My neighbors tease, they say they know this is where my ex-boyfriends are. But that's not where they are. But seriously, it's this, the dust to dust thing, the fact that the fallen, the remains of the fallen will feed the future generations. Like, I just love what goes on in the compost heap. And we'll end here inside the dining room with a similar thought. One year I had grown, what are those called? The little cayenne peppers. I had grown a cayenne plant, and sometimes you have no peppers, and sometimes you get like 1 million, and what are you going to do with 1 million hot peppers when you're a one-person household? And so months before this picture was taken, and they were all lacquer red, and each one was a different shape, twisty, pretty, I pinned them with straight pins on the wooden wall in my dining room. And as the winter wore on, I'd take one down and make vegetarian chili, or take one down and, make something spicy. And around this time of year, maybe a couple of weeks from now for me, in mid-April, I got out my seedling gear and some potting mix and prepped the cell pack, and I took one down and I put the seeds in, and I got peppers again. And it's really with that thought that if we're kind of blessed to garden another season, that we can really witness, we can bear witness to the whole thing unfolding again, all its subtle, incredible manifestations. It's with that thought that I want to thank you for having me. So do we have a couple of questions? Yes, in the front here.
You have some magnificent
Pots, yes, sure. Yeah. So the house plants and so forth?
Is there a secret to your method of keeping?
Sure. So you're talking about the house plants? Yes. So, and I don't grow any Rex begonias, Rex types. I grow other fancy leaf rhizomatous begonias, but not the Rex ones, which have a lot of silver in their leaves. The Rex types don't have the right conditions for. So that's one tip is don't get the Rex types. And places like Logie's greenhouse or Cartou's both have great ones, but I steer away from the Rex. The second is expect them to get a little beat up when they live inside with us for the winter, and it's dry and hot inside for them. They're going to drop some of their leaves, and by the end, a lot of them are going to look a little straggly. So don't fault yourself. Do the best you can to keep them on the, not cold, but not baking, not near a radiator. Good bright light. Don't water them too often, but expect them to go a little bit downhill. Even the good begonia people without a greenhouse, I think they acknowledge that in a private home they're going to be a little beat up. There's a few like Little Brother Montgomery, Marmaduke, Palomar Prince. Those are three. There's a few in, again, like a Logie's or a Cartou's. We'll tell you the ones that are the most reliable and easiest as houseplants. So pick the right one and don't beat yourself up if it's not perfect by this time of year. Yes?
I know gardening is your first love affair, but are you still having a love affair with Jack?
Jack passed away a little more than 3 years ago. He had a great life, and he was my cat, in case anyone knows. He adopted me on September 11th, 2001, that morning when I arrived from the city. And he had a good spell. He did well. But he did die a few years ago, and I never adopted another animal. I just couldn't. He was too unique. Yes?
I have a question. Hi, Margaret. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
I had the pleasure of visiting your garden
Oh, good.
20 years ago, and it was
Oh.
a real inspiration to me. You were still living there, I think.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if this Pulmonaria rubra is readily available.
Yeah, a few people have it. Digging Dog Nursery, which is out in the West. I just checked their availability, and they do have it for sure. Digging Dog. Now there won't be any left for the next 5 years because you're all writing it down. But also look it up as Red Start, Pulmonaria Red Start, which is a cultivar name, but it looks exactly the same. Yes?
Would you have advice for a budding garden writer writing about, as a garden designer, arborist, horticulturalist? I'll come up with ideas, but I'm not sitting at a desk very long. People suggested taking notes and then having an assistant.
Right. Frankly, when I began the website, awaytogarden.com, part of the reason I did it is because I'd always been I was going to be full-time in my garden for the first time, and I was going to be not a reporter or an editor, I wasn't going to be working anymore on assignment, and I thought to myself, I better develop a practice that's like journaling, where I record words and pictures to, jog my memory or react to things. And it keeps them in chronological order. It's like it makes me do it, because if I scribble in a notebook, then I lose the notebook out in the yard or whatever, So a not bad idea really is to use a free like WordPress.com or Squarespace or something like that. And start something. You don't even have to make it public, but make yourself journal and make yourself attach a picture to each thing and see what happens as you see the sequence of what you have inside you and what your reactions are. But it is a practice, just like gardening is a practice and our chores are a practice. Writing is a practice, and we have to sit down and write. So what I found helpful was to make the blog, and it sort of grew into something, and I'm not suggesting you have to make that happen, but it gave me a garden journal. And now I can look back 12 years, 11 and a half years, and I'm like, oh, that bloomed 3 weeks earlier that year. Oh, that happened, and I can go, that's a good story about how my gardens changed season-wise. You know what I mean? So I would say make it a practice. Yes?
Do you do anything about Japanese lily beetles?
Oh, yeah. So the red lily leaf beetle. There's actually a really good interview with one of the scientists who's trying to figure out what to do about it, and they do have pathogen, a natural enemy, so to speak, being released in the Northeast in various areas now to try to combat it. That is working. It's been released. I think it started in Connecticut where the early releases were. But I have a good story on awaytogarden.com if you were to search for lily leaf beetle. You'd get it. It's an interview from, I think, last year, giving the latest. But basically what we have to do meantime is we have to, with all the lily relatives, we have to get out there early and sort of dig around before they wake up, and we have to squish like every day, multiple times and so forth. It's horrible. But it would be good for you to find out if in your area there is any hope, because what we're seeing is the map of where the reported decline in the beetle is happening because of these releases of a natural enemy to it. So as I said, I don't remember the exact info, but I do have the story, an interview with a scientist from last year. Let's see. Was there another one, or are we all? Oh, I'm sorry.
Running up here with the microphone. Question, but I want to learn more in this area, the spotted lanternfly.
Yes, the lanternfly, yes.
Talk a little about that so people kind of know.
I don't think I can speak about it with any authority, except that I've been, we're talking about the spotted lanternfly, invasive pest. So I can't, but it's one to absolutely look up, go home, look up, and read about and see what the news is. It seems to be moving pretty alarmingly. But I don't know. I mean, the invasive earthworms, the Asian jumping worms, I'm a little more up to date on. Certain things that where I've spoken to someone in some kind of authority recently, but that's when I've just been reading, as you have as a consumer, wondering, reading some of the cooperative extension bulletins. Yes?
I have a question about plastics.
Yeah, plastics.
No one seems to talk about the, organic, easy to go to, ordering bulk mulch, making your own compost. But beyond that, I find gardening.
Heavy on the plastics?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I don't hear much about it.
I do, I think there is a certain faction of people who are concerned about it. I mean, I just had a question from a reader 2 days ago about, I had did an interview with a PhD graduate at University of Maine who's been studying soil solarization and how to best do it in the northern farming and gardening, and black plastic or clear plastic, and when and how many weeks and so forth for weed control, organic weed control. And so she and I talked about, what about the plastic? Because if you get thin plastic that's cheaper, you throw it away, and then we're just adding more and more plastic. So I do get people asking me, readers asking me, saying, what kind of plastic? And if you're going to use plastic in the garden, sheeting, my idea is that you should get the 6 mil kind, 5 or 6 mil kind. That is, like, I've used the same sheet on this one bed where I put my pumpkins. I use the same sheet every year. I probably had it for 10 years because I got the really thick stuff. So I'm not recycling plastic. When I buy seedling trays, well, first of all, you can make wooden flats, and then you don't ever have to buy seedling trays. Second of all, if you want to buy seedling trays, invest in the really good ones that are going to give you 5 or 10 years of service, not the flimsy crap, excuse me. But do you know what I mean? I mean, so that we don't have one-use plastic, which is the most problematic thing. So I think it's a very good point, and I know I think about it. I don't know what the industry is going to do in terms of pricing. I think they're addicted to the plastic, I think, is the problem. Yeah. I can't see so well.
There's another one up here on your left. Margaret, you're coming up with the.
My left? My right?
What do you think about purchasing praying mantises or ladybugs from Kellogg's?
I'm not a introducer of insects from other places. It's not my thing. If I operated a commercial greenhouse where I had used, to propagate seedlings or houseplants or whatever, floral industry stuff, and I had been using chemicals and I wanted to be more conscientious, I would be definitely using biologicals, including living releases of living organisms like that. But as a gardener, I don't think it's my job and to tinker with stuff. And the ladybugs, the Asian lady beetles, I mean, I don't know. A lot of the stuff that's being sold isn't even a native insect. So to me, no. Again, if I were working in a controlled greenhouse environment and compared to endless sprays, I think it would be a good thing. I don't feel qualified, to make an evaluation about the impact of moving pests around the country that have either been wild captured or reared in a foreign environment and so on and so forth. So when I don't understand something, I tend to say no to it, I guess. And that's not maybe the most informed point of view, but that's my point of view. And my last name is Roach, so I have a good point of view about insects. That gives me authority. Yes.
So I've been a tremendous fan of yours for years, and I've got
Thank you.
garden blog for years and learned a tremendous amount. I'm curious about how you are evolving with native plants. You picked up family on your... Yes.
So how I'm approaching, that's a great question, and it's something I should have talked more about. So I have this 2.3 acre garden. It started as a collector's garden in 30-something years ago. It was all about the rarest. I showed you the Hylomica and an Asian ephemeral. I have a zillion different kinds of unusual, formerly rare plants that were rare at the time. Thankfully, I got those 50 Ilex verticillata, the winterberry hollies, the natives. I put in the spice bushes, Lindera benzoin, Aurelia racemosa, big herbaceous perennial, native, etc. Thankfully, because I loved the birds, I had, square footage-wise, a bunch of natives. What I've done in recent years to up the native component, I've left it like a collector's garden right around the house. And in the outer areas, I've unmowed, like you saw in one of those pictures, the upper field, that amoebic area that's unmown with little blue stem and goldenrod and asters and whatever. I've increased the size of that from where you saw it in the picture. So I'm kind of unmowing. I'm moving in from my fence perimeter where I used to mow all the way to the perimeter of the property. And it was like, there's not really anything out there. I'm not really even going there. Why don't I let it be a little wilder? So I'm kind of doing it that way, almost like passively rather than planting. But even in a conventional size yard, I think, and I alluded to this before, if you had a fence or a hedge, and you could then give up 5 or 6 or 8 feet of lawn adjacent to that, even if it's a 40-foot long strip, 6 feet wide and 40 feet, you could put in native viburnums and native winterberries, for instance, and really up your native quotient without getting rid of your collector's garden, if that's what you have, as I do, right around your house in the beds. Do you know what I mean? So changing the balance by cheating like around some of the areas that are not used right now, and these are low maintenance things I'm suggesting, unmowing a field or part of a field, putting in winterberries and native viburnums, things that don't require a lot of care. So that's I'm like layering it in now by cheating some of the outer areas to up the balance of native. Thank you for asking that. So, thank you, everybody.